At 65 years old, I thought I had seen enough of life's cruelties to be immune from surprise. But the morning of my son's wedding carried with it an ache that I couldn't quite shake. A sense that this was the day my sacrifices would finally mean something, and that, at long last, he would look at me with pride instead of obligation. I stood on the steps of the grand Hudson Valley estate he had chosen for his wedding, a place he insisted would capture the perfect blend of rustic chic and East Coast luxury for the thousands of followers who would be tuning in live. And though I had drained my savings, my late husband's pension, and even taken a second mortgage on my modest Connecticut home to fund this extravagant day, I told myself it was worth it because it was for him, for Matthew, my only child, my boy who had grown from the quiet teenager who once begged me to buy him his first camcorder into a 33-year-old social media celebrity with millions of subscribers and brand endorsements I barely understood. I had never cared for hashtags, ring lights, or the glossy spectacle of his online world, but I understood love, and love was why I agreed when he asked me to finance a wedding that cost more than any three homes on my street combined. Love was why I bit my tongue when he spoke to me like a personal assistant rather than a mother. Love was why I convinced myself that today, with all the cameras, champagne, and the carefully curated perfection of this vineyard-turned-event venue, would be the day my son finally saw me, not just as the woman who paid the bills, but as the mother who had given up everything so he could thrive. I had chosen a simple navy dress, not designer like the suits worn by the groom's friends or the glittering gowns on the bridesmaids, but one I knew flattered my aging figure and didn't clash with the endless aesthetic planning that had consumed Matthew and his fiancée, Claire, for the past year. Walking the gravel path lined with imported roses, I felt a pang of memory. Matthew, at 5 years old, running through our backyard in New Haven with a toy sword, shouting that he would protect me forever, and me promising silently to protect him from the world no matter the cost. Memories that felt both tender and mocking now, because here I was, decades later, entering a day where my role had been minimized to a bank account, and, if Matthew's request were to be believed, a distant background figure. The estate buzzed with activity as caterers in black uniforms scurried across the patio, adjusting tables draped in ivory linen, as the wedding planner, an elegant man named Jordan with silver hair and the kind of calm authority you only found in Manhattan professionals, checked his iPad and reassured vendors that the drone operators had the best camera angles for the live stream. And as I approached him to ask if Matthew needed anything, Jordan gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind that told me he had already seen too much of the way my son spoke to me during the months of planning, the sharp tone he used when I dared to suggest a cheaper florist, the way he brushed off my tears when I explained that this wedding was costing me my future. Still, Jordan bowed his head respectfully and said, "Mothers like you make weddings like this possible." Words meant as comfort, but which sank into me like a reminder of my invisibility. Because I didn't want to be the silent sponsor. I wanted to be the proud mother sitting in the front row, helping my son with his tie, adjusting his cufflinks like I have had imagined in daydreams during long nights of double shifts at the diner. Instead, when I knocked gently on the suite where Matthew was getting ready, one of his groomsmen, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a smirk that reeked of entitlement, blocked the door and told me it wasn't a good time, that Matt's in the zone, as if my son were preparing for a prize fight rather than his vows. And when I insisted, when I said I just wanted a moment, I heard Matthew's voice from inside, sharp and impatient. "Mom, not now. You'll ruin the vibe." Ruin the vibe. 3 words that stung more than any insult I'd ever received. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't my son's wedding. It was his performance, and I wasn't invited to play a part beyond paying for the stage. Still, I smiled politely, nodded, and told myself that once he walked down the aisle and saw me in the audience, once the music swelled and the vows were exchanged, he would remember, he would soften, he would come back to me. But as the morning unfolded into a blur of strangers complimenting the decor, of journalists snapping pictures for lifestyle magazines, of influencers posing at champagne stations, I found myself standing in the shadows, watching Matthew bask in admiration while ignoring the one person who had built the foundation for his success, my chest tight with a mix of pride, grief, and a dawning realization that this day might not end in the recognition I had so desperately hoped for, but in something far more devastating. The ceremony began beneath a canopy of fairy lights strung across the vineyard lawn. the kind of cinematic setup Matthew had insisted upon because it would go viral when the drone swooped overhead. And as the string quartet played an ethereal arrangement of pop ballads, I forced myself to breathe evenly, to hold my head high, to remember that no matter how much he had dismissed me that morning, I was still his mother, and mothers do not crumble in front of strangers. Rows of chairs filled with guests in designer suits and sequin gowns stretched across the grass, but when I approached the usher to ask about my seat, I noticed the hesitation in his eyes before he pointed me to the far side, 2 rows behind the photographers, my view partially blocked by tripods and light stands. And though a surge of indignation rose inside me, I swallowed it down because the last thing I wanted was to embarrass my son on his big day. I sat quietly, listening as whispers floated around me, conversations about sponsorships, brand collaborations, and the exclusive magazine feature that Claire had negotiated for their wedding, realizing that for many of the guests, this was less about love and more about publicity, a stage where they could shine in borrowed light. Then the music shifted, and Claire appeared, radiant in a gown dripping with crystals, her every movement deliberate for the cameras, her smile wide but hollow, and Matthew's face lit up not with the vulnerable joy of a man in love, but with the smug confidence of a celebrity performing for an adoring crowd. When the officiant invited him to say his vows, he took Claire's hands and launched into a monologue that sounded less like a declaration of devotion and more like a viral script full of hashtags and catchphrases, the kind of language engineered for sound bites. And I felt a pit in my stomach because I realized he wasn't speaking to his bride. He was speaking to the millions watching online, shaping his narrative as the perfect influencer groom. Still, I clapped when others clapped, wiped away tears I wasn't sure were pride or heartbreak, and reminded myself that maybe, just maybe, things would soften once the cameras were off. But then, during the reception, it happened. The moment that would fracture the fragile thread I had been clinging to. The moment when I became not a mother, but a prop, discarded in the cruelest way. I had approached Matthew's table after the first dance, carrying a small wrapped box I had saved for him, a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, the man who had worked 60 years in a factory to give us the stability that allowed Matthew to dream, a watch I had kept in my dresser for decades, waiting for the right moment to pass down, believing today was that day. And when I placed it in his hands, whispering that it was a piece of his family, he looked at me with annoyance, eyes darting toward the cameras, and said loud enough for guests to hear, "Mom, seriously? You're ruining the vibe again," before shoving the box back at me. Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and humiliating, and before I could retreat, he stood, towering over me, his face flushed with irritation, and in a gesture that replayed in my mind like a nightmare, he slapped the box from my hands so hard it crashed to the floor, the watch skidding under the dessert table as guests gasped and phones lifted to capture the spectacle. I froze. My ears ringing, my hands trembling, the sting not physical but emotional, because in that instant, my son, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the teenager I had cheered for at school plays, the man whose dreams I had financed with every ounce of my being, had chosen to humiliate me publicly, to reduce me to a punchline in his performance. And the betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical wound splitting me open. Claire laughed nervously, one manicured hand on Matthew's arm as if to calm him. But the damage was done, and when I bent to retrieve the shattered box, I heard a guest whisper, "Can you believe his mom pulled that stunt? On camera?" As though I had been the aggressor, as though decades of sacrifice meant nothing compared to his curated image. I wanted to scream, to demand that someone acknowledge the cruelty, but I could not find my voice, and instead I walked away, each step heavy with shame, my body trembling as though I had been physically struck, until I found myself standing alone near the service entrance, the muffled beat of pop music and laughter filtering through the walls, while I clutched the broken box to my chest and tried to breathe. In that moment, something inside me cracked, a quiet but resolute voice rising beneath the humiliation, telling me that if Matthew saw me only as a bank account, as a background figure to be discarded once my usefulness had ended, then I had been complicit by giving him everything without boundaries. And if I wanted to reclaim even a shred of dignity, I could not continue playing the part of the silent financer. The decision crystallized in that quiet hallway. Not revenge, not anger, but survival. a determination that I would no longer fund his illusions, no longer allow my love to be weaponized against me, no longer stand by while my own son erased me. I straightened my shoulders, wiped my tears, and walked back into the party not as a mother desperate for scraps of affection, but as a woman who had finally understood the cost of unconditional sacrifice. And though no one noticed me slipping out of the estate minutes later, my absence marked the beginning of a transformation Matthew would never see coming, because from that day forward, I would rewrite the narrative, not as the mother who paid for his wedding, but as the woman who took back her life. Driving back to my modest home in Connecticut that night, the hum of the highway beneath my old Honda felt almost hypnotic, each mile marker passing like a metronome to the thoughts racing through my mind. And though my body ached from the long day, my spirit burned with something I hadn't felt in years: resolve. I'd spent decades being quiet, being agreeable, sacrificing without question for Matthew, convincing myself that a mother's love meant unconditional giving. But sitting alone in the dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, the remnants of the shattered watch still in my purse, I realized love without respect was not love at all. It was exploitation. And I had enabled it by never drawing a line, by treating my financial support as endless even when it bled me dry. I thought back to the second mortgage I had taken out 6 months ago when Matthew insisted on an exclusive venue, how I had signed papers with shaking hands but told myself it was temporary, that once he was married, he would settle down and repay me, that once the world saw him as a husband, he would finally recognize me as more than an ATM. But now I knew better. He wasn't going to change, and worse, he didn't want to, because the persona he had built thrived on control, on spectacle, on diminishing anything that didn't fit his narrative, and I, his mother, had become collateral damage in his pursuit of perfection. As dawn painted the horizon in pale pink, I made coffee stronger than usual and pulled out the thick binder of receipts, invoices, and loan documents I had meticulously kept since the wedding planning began, a habit I had developed during years of balancing shifts at the diner with bills that always seemed to arrive two at a time. Page after page, I saw the extent of my sacrifice. $275,000 wired to vendors, another $45,000 for designer attire Matthew insisted the groomsmen needed, $30,000 for Claire's custom shoes, and endless smaller charges that had trickled out of my checking account like blood from a wound. It was nearly $500,000 in total. Money I didn't truly have, money that meant my retirement fund was gone, my future security obliterated, and yet not once had Matthew thanked me. He hadn't even looked me in the eye when he asked for more. Rage pulsed hot in my veins, not the uncontrolled kind, but the steady burn of clarity, and as I sat at the table, I knew what I had to do: stop the bleeding, reclaim control, and make sure Matthew felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, the weight of his own choices. By noon that same day, I was at the bank, speaking to a loan officer with tired eyes who explained gently that foreclosure was inevitable if I couldn't keep up with payments. And though her words stung, they also freed me, because if I had already lost so much, why should I continue pretending I had anything left to give? I asked her what my options were, and she suggested bankruptcy as a way to start over, to wipe away the debts tied to Matthew's wedding. And though humiliation curled in my stomach at the thought, I realized humiliation was nothing new. What mattered now was survival, dignity, and setting a precedent that my son would never again use me as collateral for his vanity. The next stop was my attorney's office, a small-town lawyer named Evelyn, who had handled my will years ago, and when I explained through tears what had happened, she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You've given him everything, but the law doesn't say you have to destroy yourself for him. You have the power to stop this." Her words sank deep, planting seeds of strategy, and together we drafted documents to formally remove Matthew from any financial connections to my estate, to cut him out of inheritance until he could prove responsibility, to lock away what little remained so that he couldn't bleed me further. It wasn't about revenge, it was about finally choosing myself after a lifetime of choosing him. Still, that night, as I packed boxes in my living room, preparing to downsize before the bank could take the house, the ache of motherhood pressed hard against my ribs, because no matter how cruel he had been, no matter how much he had humiliated me, he was still my son, the boy I had once rocked to sleep with lullabies, the teenager I had stayed up with during panic attacks before exams, the young man I had driven across state lines to audition for his first film project. And letting go of him felt like severing a part of my own soul. But I knew that if I didn't, if I kept feeding the cycle, I would disappear entirely, and then there would be nothing left of me for anyone, not even myself. So I made a vow in the stillness of that emptying house. I would no longer fund Matthew's illusions. I would no longer apologize for boundaries. I would no longer measure my worth by the size of my sacrifices. And though the road ahead terrified me, I felt the first flicker of liberation in years, a spark of something that tasted like freedom. And I promised myself I would protect it at all costs, even if it meant protecting it from my own son. The fallout began quicker than I expected, because in Matthew's world, every shift, every obstacle, every perceived slight was content to be broadcast, monetized, and spun into sympathy. And within 3 days of me filing the bankruptcy papers and legally cutting him out of my estate, my phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications from friends and even strangers sending me clips of Matthew's live stream where he sat in his pristine loft in Brooklyn, framed by neon lights and expensive decor, telling his millions of followers that his own mother had betrayed him by backing out of her promises, painting me as a bitter, jealous woman trying to sabotage his happiness. I sat on the worn couch in my downsized apartment, a modest one-bedroom I'd rented after moving out of my foreclosed home, and watched him cry on cue, his face a perfect blend of anguish and outrage, his voice quivering as he said, "She walked out of my wedding, she embarrassed me, and now she's trying to ruin my future by cutting me off financially, after I gave her the chance to be part of my journey." The comments scrolled fast, some fans calling me selfish, others demanding my side of the story, and a few sharp-eyed viewers pointing out the absurdity of a grown man in his 30s blaming his mother for not financing his lifestyle. But the narrative Matthew crafted was sticky, and I knew better than anyone how skilled he was at spinning reality into a script that benefited him. Still, instead of rushing to defend myself online, I turned inward, leaning on Evelyn's advice to stay silent publicly until the legal dust settled, and in the quiet I found strength I didn't know I had, journaling every memory of sacrifice, every receipt, every moment that had led here, building a fortress of truth that no live stream could erase. But Matthew wasn't finished. And within a week, Claire called me, not with compassion, but with venom, her voice sharp as glass as she accused me of ruining their brand deals, of costing them sponsorships because people don't want to invest in a groom who looks like he comes from a broken family. And though her words cut deep, I felt a strange clarity listening to her, because for the first time, it was obvious. Matthew had chosen not love, not partnership, but a co-conspirator in exploitation, someone who saw me not as a mother-in-law, but as a wallet. "You'll regret this," she hissed before hanging up. And maybe once upon a time I would have crumbled under that threat, but instead I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that regret was already behind me. The only thing left was rebuilding. Yet the real escalation came 2 weeks later when Matthew showed up unannounced at my apartment door. Not the polished influencer, but a man unraveling, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, his phone still clutched in one hand like a weapon, already streaming live as he pushed past me without asking permission, narrating to his audience how he was confronting the woman who betrayed him. I stood frozen as thousands of viewers flooded the screen, commenting on my modest furniture, my plain clothes, mocking the simplicity of my life compared to the luxury Matthew flaunted. And when he turned the camera to me and demanded, "Tell them why you abandoned me on my wedding day," something inside me snapped. But not with rage, but with the calm steel of a woman who had finally had enough. I looked straight into the lens, my voice steady, and said, "Because no mother should be slapped down for loving her son too much. Because sacrifice without respect isn't love. It's slavery. And because I deserve better, even from my own child." The comments exploded, some siding with me, others accusing me of manipulation, but I didn't care, because for the first time, I had spoken my truth directly into the same machine he had used to destroy me. And whether or not the audience believed me, Matthew knew in that moment that I would not be silent anymore. He ended the stream abruptly, his face pale, his jaw tight, and as he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled, I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me, but beneath it a flicker of triumph, because I had faced him, I had faced his stage, and I had not bowed. Still, I knew this was only the beginning, that Matthew's pride and Claire's ambition would not let this go quietly. And as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I wondered not if they would strike back, but how. And I vowed that next time, I would be ready. The days that followed his stormy visit blurred into a strange mix of quiet resilience and loud chaos. Because while my apartment was finally still, no cameras, no guests, no invoices piling on the kitchen table, the outside world seemed to be roaring with Matthew's version of events. And every morning when I braved the walk to the corner cafe for coffee, I would catch whispers, side glances, even the occasional stranger who recognized me from the viral clip of our confrontation, some offering sympathetic smiles, others smirking as though I were a villain who had starved her golden child. And though I wanted to shrink into invisibility, something in me refused, because I had hidden long enough, sacrificed long enough. And if Matthew wanted a war of narratives, then I would not let him fight unopposed. Still, I hadn't expected how far he and Claire would go, because within 2 weeks, I received a letter from a law firm in Manhattan, a glossy envelope embossed with gold lettering, accusing me of breach of oral contract for supposedly promising to fund not only their wedding, but their first year of marriage expenses, including a luxury apartment lease. And as I sat trembling in my tiny kitchen reading the absurdity, I almost laughed, because it was so outrageous it bordered on parody. But then I remembered the power of money and spin, and I knew they weren't joking. They were trying to bleed me legally now that I had refused to bleed financially. I rushed the letter to Evelyn, who adjusted her glasses, scanned the pages, and said with a tight smile, "This won't hold up in court. Not for a second. But their aim isn't legal victory. It's intimidation. It's to break you down emotionally so you fold." And though her reassurance steadied me, a tremor of fear still lingered, because the idea of facing my son across a courtroom floor felt like a nightmare I hadn't yet found the courage to imagine. But life has a way of revealing allies in the darkest corners. And one evening, as I was sorting through boxes of old photos to remind myself of the boy Matthew had once been, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. When I answered, a soft voice introduced herself as Amelia, a former assistant of Matthew's who had seen my story online and wanted me to know the truth. That Matthew and Claire were drowning in debt, that their lavish lifestyle was a house of cards propped up by sponsorships already wavering since the wedding scandal, and that their smear campaign against me wasn't just cruelty, it was desperation, an attempt to control the narrative before their empire crumbled. Amelia confessed that she had left after Claire berating her for suggesting they cut back on expenses. And though fear laced her words, she said she couldn't stomach the lies anymore, especially against a mother who had given everything. Her call lit a fire in me, not because it erased the pain of Matthew's betrayal, but because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that beneath the glitter of his brand there was rot, and rot eventually collapses under its own weight. So, with Evelyn's help, I began quietly gathering not just my receipts, but witness statements from those who had seen my sacrifices, from neighbors who had watched me work double shifts to pay his tuition, from family friends who remembered the loans I had taken to buy him equipment, and even from Amelia, who bravely offered to testify if it came to that. I wasn't building a case for money, I was building a wall of truth. Something no influence or spin could erase, something that might not restore my relationship with Matthew, but at least restore my dignity. Meanwhile, the media storm intensified, with tabloids publishing headlines like "Influencer Groom Abandoned by Greedy Mother," alongside paparazzi shots of Matthew and Claire posing at events as though nothing was wrong. And though it stung, I noticed cracks appearing in the coverage, small blogs, independent journalists starting to question the narrative, asking why a 33-year-old millionaire needed his mother's financial backing. And slowly, quietly, the tide of public opinion began to shift. But Matthew, too proud to admit fault, doubled down, launching a video series about toxic parents, each episode a thinly veiled attack on me, his voice dripping with false sincerity as he told stories twisted from our past. And though my heart broke hearing memories weaponized against me, I clung to Evelyn's advice: don't fight in his arena. The truth is stronger when it isn't shrouded. So, I stayed silent publicly, even as I rebuilt privately, learning to live within my new means, finding small joys in simple things like gardening on my apartment balcony, joining a book club at the local library, and even daring to smile again when a kind neighbor named Harold invited me to coffee without pity in his eyes. For the first time in decades, I was tasting life that wasn't measured by my son's demands, and though grief shadowed me, liberation walked beside it. Still, I knew the battle wasn't over, and one evening, as I was tucking away the latest letter from Matthew's lawyers and looked at a framed photo of him as a boy on my shelf, his gap-toothed smile radiant with innocence, I whispered aloud, "I'm sorry, Matthew, but I won't let you destroy me anymore." And with those words, I felt the first real peace settle into my bones, the kind that comes not from winning or losing, but from finally choosing yourself after a lifetime of being chosen last. By the time the court date was set for the ridiculous breach of oral contract claim Matthew's lawyers had filed, the entire ordeal had become more than just a family feud. It was a spectacle, with reporters lingering outside the courthouse steps, camera flashes going off like fireworks, and my name trending alongside my son's on social media, though rarely in ways I would have chosen. I had never stepped foot in a courtroom as a defendant before, my only brushes with the law being traffic tickets and once serving on a jury. And as Evelyn walked beside me in her navy suit, her voice steady as she reminded me, "You're not on trial here. Matthew is." I tried to let her confidence seep into me, but the sight of my son standing across the marble lobby, flanked by Claire in a blood-red dress that screamed intimidation, made my stomach turn. Because no matter how much armor I tried to wear, he was still my boy, and facing him in this arena felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Yet the proceedings that followed quickly made clear just how flimsy his case was, because when the judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes who seemed immune to celebrity charm, asked for evidence of this so-called oral contract, Matthew's team produced nothing but vague emails, text messages taken out of context, and clips from his live streams where he insisted I had promised him the world. Evelyn countered with my binder of receipts, affidavits from neighbors and friends, even Amelia's sworn statement about the manipulation she had witnessed. And as each page was laid out, I saw Matthew's confidence falter, his performative smirk slipping into a tight grimace, Claire whispering furiously in his ear as if she could will the lies into reality. But what shook me most wasn't the legal back and forth. It was when the judge looked directly at me after hours of testimony and said, "Mrs. Anderson, you've spent a lifetime providing for a son who seems to believe adulthood comes without responsibility. The law will not enable entitlement. Case dismissed." The gavel cracked, and with it something inside me cracked too. Not in pain, but in release, like a chain snapping after decades of weight. I walked out of that courthouse not with victory paraded before the cameras, but with quiet dignity, my head held high as reporters shouted questions I refused to answer, because this story wasn't theirs to spin anymore. It was mine to live. Yet Matthew, true to form, refused to accept defeat. And that evening he launched a 3-hour live stream ranting about corruption, betrayal, and how I had weaponized the system against him, tears sliding down his face on cue, Claire nodding dramatically at his side. But for the first time I noticed something different in the comments. Less blind adoration, more skepticism. Fans asking why he, a man with brand deals and millions in revenue, needed to sue his own mother for money. Others pointing out that entitlement was not abuse, that maybe, just maybe, he had been the villain all along. The shift was small, but it was seismic. And over the following weeks, I watched as sponsorship after sponsorship quietly pulled back, as tabloids replaced flattering coverage with headlines like, "Influencer groom exposed as spoiled brat." And though a part of me grieved for the boy whose empire I had once dreamed of building, another part felt vindicated because truth had begun to shine through the cracks of his performance. Meanwhile, I leaned into the life I was slowly building in my quiet corner of Connecticut. Harold became more than a neighbor, joining me on long walks by the river, showing me the simple joy of laughter unburdened by obligation. And the women in my book club became confidants who reminded me that reinvention at 65 wasn't just possible, it was powerful. Still, I won't lie and say it was easy, because at night when the apartment was quiet and the world outside buzzed with my son's downfall, I would stare at his childhood photos and ache, wondering if I had failed him by giving too much, by never teaching him the boundaries he now resented, by confusing sacrifice with love. But then I would remember the slap, the public humiliation, the lawsuit, and I would remind myself that love doesn't mean erasure, that motherhood is not martyrdom, and that sometimes the hardest act of love is stepping back and letting your child face the consequences of their own choices. And so, as Matthew's empire trembled and mine, small and modest though it was, began to bloom with quiet joy, I found myself no longer mourning what I had lost, but marveling at what I had finally found: myself. The unraveling of Matthew's carefully constructed empire wasn't sudden, like a tower collapsing, but more like a slow, agonizing rot spreading through the foundation, each week bringing another crack that he tried desperately to patch with bravado. And as much as it broke my heart to watch, I also knew it was inevitable, because no life built entirely on image could withstand the weight of truth. First, came the sponsorship withdrawals, big brands quietly backing away after seeing his lawsuit dismissed and his reputation questioned. Then came the unpaid bills surfacing on social media when vendors he had stiffed started speaking out. And finally, the cracks in his marriage to Claire, who once looked at him as a golden ticket, but now eyed him with barely concealed disdain, her Instagram captions shifting from "my king" to vague complaints about toxic men and fake support systems, the kind of hints designed to prepare her followers for an exit strategy. I tried not to follow too closely, but it was impossible to avoid the headlines. And when one morning a neighbor slipped a copy of the New York Post under my door with the cover screaming, "Influencer groom evicted from luxury loft," I sat at the kitchen table, staring at his sunken face in the photo, boxes stacked around him on the sidewalk, and felt a swirl of emotions: grief for the boy he had been, pity for the man he had become, and yes, a flicker of satisfaction that perhaps now he might understand what I had been trying to teach: that life is not a performance, and respect cannot be bought. But Matthew was nothing if not stubborn, and instead of humbling himself, he doubled down, showing up at local events, crashing other influencers' live streams, even trying to monetize his downfall with a docuseries proposal that no network touched. And when Claire finally left him, filing for divorce and airing her own grievances online, his spiral accelerated, the once curated life unraveling in public like a car crash you couldn't look away from. Through it all, I stayed silent, not because I didn't have words, but because I had finally learned that my power didn't come from feeding his chaos, it came from protecting my peace. And while he raged and flailed, I planted tomatoes on my balcony, joined Harold at local concerts, and wrote in my journal about a life that was finally mine. But the past has a way of knocking at your door, and one evening it did so literally, when I opened it to find Matthew standing there, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his once flawless skin marked by stress, his eyes red-shot but pleading, and for the first time in years he wasn't holding a phone, wasn't streaming, wasn't performing. He stood there shaking, voice breaking as he said, "Mom, I don't know where else to go." And in that moment, the mother in me warred with the woman who had been humiliated, betrayed, and nearly ruined, my instincts to embrace him clashing with my hard-earned resolve. I let him in, but not with the open arms of old, instead with cautious boundaries, offering him a seat, a glass of water, and silence until he spoke. And when he finally admitted through tears that he had nothing left, no home, no sponsors, no friends, I listened, but didn't rescue, because rescue had been the mistake of my past. "I need money," he whispered eventually, and the old me would have reached for my checkbook before the sentence ended, but this new me leaned back steady and calm and said, "What you need is responsibility, Matthew. Money won't fix what's broken inside you." His face crumpled, not in anger, but in recognition, and though he tried to argue, to guilt me with memories of scraped knees and bedtime stories, I held firm, repeating softly, "I love you, but I will not save you again." The silence between us was thick, broken only by his sobs, and though it tore at me, I knew this was the truest act of love I had ever given him, refusing to enable, refusing to erase consequences, refusing to let my sacrifice be the soil for his entitlement anymore. Eventually he left, shoulders hunched, and I watched him walk down the hall with the same ache I had felt when he walked into kindergarten for the first time, uncertain if he would thrive or stumble, but knowing he had to walk it alone. That night I cried till dawn, mourning not just the son that I had lost, but the role I had played in losing him, yet feeling strangely free. Because for the first time in 33 years, my love was no longer chained to my wallet. And though the future with Matthew was uncertain, my future with myself was finally clear. The months after Matthew's tearful visit unfolded like the slow turning of seasons, each day peeling back another layer of grief and resilience, until what remained was not the shattered woman who had once begged for her son's affection, but someone stronger, clearer, and strangely hopeful, even in the absence of reconciliation. I never stopped being his mother. I don't think that's possible, even when the bond feels frayed beyond repair, but I stopped measuring my worth by his validation. And in that shift, my life began to blossom in ways I hadn't imagined at 65. Bankruptcy had wiped the slate clean, and though starting over with nothing sounded terrifying on paper, in practice, it was liberating. My days no longer consumed by bills for things I didn't need or sacrifices for dreams that weren't mine, but instead filled with small joys: Coffee with Harold in the mornings, community gardening where I dug my hands into the earth and felt something grow again, evenings spent at the library leading a memoir writing group where women my age poured their stories into notebooks and realized, as I had, that it's never too late to reclaim your narrative. And though Matthew's name still appeared in headlines now and then, usually tied to another failed project or dramatic outburst, I stopped reading them, choosing instead to focus on the life I was actively building. Because, for the first time in decades, the story was not about him. It was about me. One unexpected twist came when Amelia, his former assistant, reached out again, telling me she had started a nonprofit aimed at helping families rebuild after financial abuse by relatives, and she wanted me to join the board as a founding member, saying my story had inspired her to believe change was possible. I hesitated, unsure if I had the strength to make my private wounds public, but then I thought about all the mothers sitting in silence, bleeding themselves dry for ungrateful children, and I realized maybe my pain could become purpose. So I said yes. And soon I found myself speaking at small community events, my voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as I shared not just the humiliation of that wedding day, but the triumph of standing up afterward. And each time a woman grabbed my hand with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Me too," I felt less alone, less ashamed, more certain that the choice to choose myself had been the right one. Matthew never attended these talks, never acknowledged them, though once I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he had seen a clip online and turned it off immediately, unable to face the mirror of my truth. But I didn't need him to validate it anymore, because the truth was mine, and it set me free. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the Connecticut riverbank, Harold asked me to marry him, not with grandeur or spectacle, but with a quiet smile and a simple silver band. And though part of me trembled at the thought of tying my life to someone else after so many years defined by another's needs, I said yes, because Harold had never asked me to sacrifice myself, only to share myself, and there was a difference so profound it felt like oxygen in my lungs. We wed in a small ceremony at the community garden. My book club friends and fellow board members gathered around. No drones, no sponsorships, no designer gowns, just laughter, food made with love, and a happiness so genuine it made me ache with gratitude. I didn't invite Matthew. I couldn't. Not yet, but I left a seat empty with a small card that said, "For my son," a gesture not of reconciliation, but of hope, because though I had let go of saving him, I hadn't let go of loving him. And maybe one day he would sit in that chair, not as the influencer he had been, but as the man he could still become. Until then, I carried on, waking each morning with a peace I once thought impossible, tending to my garden, holding Harold's hand, and speaking truth where silence had once lived. And as I stood under the wide Connecticut sky, I realized that sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger, not retaliation, but survival, joy, and the unshakable knowledge that you can lose almost everything and still find yourself stronger, freer, and finally whole.